Hello, this is the Monday Agenda. The Monday Agenda today is celebrating 70 years of United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And with me on the program is Ambassador George Kuchio, who is the UNHCR Deputy Representative. Very welcome to the program.
Thank you, sir.
And also we have Gloria Kalabamu, the Vice President for Tanganyika Law Society. Is very welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
Your Excellency, just to start, the viewers would be very keen to understand the 70 years of United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Take us a little bit back to this celebration this year.
Okay, 70 years because that's about the time the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees was formed. We are talking of the year 1950, sometime in December, to be precise, on the 14th day of December. This is when the United Nations created this office. Of course, there had been several offices that were taking care of refugee issues from the League of Nations and what have you. But at this point in time, it became clear to the international community that a full-fledged office on a full-time basis to address refugee matters needs to be in existence. So that is the point about the 70 years.
Okay. And looking on to what has transpired, what has evolved for the past 70 years, maybe you can tell us.
Yes.
You've mentioned the League of Nations, then the UN, then several offices, but in terms of evolution of events and activities.
Yes. The most interesting thing is that when this office was formed at that point in time, it was supposed to be in existence for 3 years only.
Is that so?
Because the international community felt that the refugee situation would have been addressed at that point in time.
Okay.
You see, a refugee situation is not pleasant. People being displaced, persons dying, turmoil around the world. So the international community wanted to address this situation and then close up the office after 3 years. Regrettably, 70 years down the line, we are there. So much as you can look at it as a celebration, it's also a bit of a daunting exercise in the sense that we should have finished this business some time back and gone back home. But at the same time, if you look at the resilience that has been there from the international community, from the donors, from countries like Tanzania and others, taking care of refugees for 70 years, that is a compliment that you want to make to these countries.
Okay. And is that what you would say we are celebrating?
I would say that we are celebrating humanity in the sense that in the last 70 years, persons who don't have homes, people who have been persecuted and have run away, not knowing anywhere to go, have been taken care of by the international community. But I wouldn't want us to be here again 70 years from now. My hope is that in a few years' time, the turmoil that we have seen, the growing numbers that we continue to see, will be something that somehow we can put behind us.
Okay.
Yes.
Awesome. Maybe Gloria, you can tell us, before we look onto the convention, from the legal perspective, do you see, in your opinion, that one day the world will be without refugees?
I would like to see that particular event happening, and right now, even Tanzania, its perspective is to help out the country with turmoils, so that those countries can have dialogues in their countries and find a way to settle out, because they have seen the adverse effect of having refugees. Your people in another country in which they have to stay under asylum, they have to be protected. Why not you leaders, why not you, the people in the particular country, finish out your differences and address those particular issues that may result into a refugee situation, whether it is war, whether it is genocide or whatever, you know? So most countries have make a U-turn from their differences. A good example is a country like Rwanda. They've had a national reconciliation, they've talked about their issues. Now they do not foresee a refugee situation in the future because they have addressed their problems and they've come up with solutions. So I would really like to see a future whereby we do not have to deal with refugees.
It's the wish, as the ambassador has mentioned as well. Ambassador, back to you. The 1951 convention. Is that the one that stipulated the founding of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees?
Yes. The 1951 Convention is the law, if I might put it that way, an international law that the United Nations came up with after the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees had been formed in 1950. Okay. And the idea was to commit member states of the United Nations to sign this particular law or instrument. It's the instrument that tells us who a refugee is. A refugee is not just anybody walking around. There is a clear definition. The law also outlines what are the obligations of member states towards the refugees. What are the rights of the refugees as well? And to an extent, you could say the obligations of the refugee as a person enjoying asylum. So this is the book, if I might put it that way, that outlines what refugee business is all about, what it means, and how it should be handled by the international community. And a number of countries are state parties to this convention. By state parties, I mean they have signed the convention, they have accepted it, so that when refugees come on their territory, they have some modus operandi, if I might put it that way, of how to deal with these refugees. And again, from this particular instrument, countries have come up with national laws to define who are refugees, like Tanzania, for instance. Yeah.
Before we go to the Tanzanian law and look onto the things on the ground, just to understand from your just ended statement, we've seen on media, but of course there's a difference between an asylum seeker and a refugee, which you'll probably want to highlight shortly, but we've seen on media a number of people wanting to seek, can I call that asylum, abroad, and then they're either rejected or they died attempting to do that, or they're, what is that situation?
Okay. Precisely, that is the point why you need to have some codified law defining who an asylum seeker is and who a refugee is.
Okay.
Let me first start there, because the institution of asylum can be abused. We don't want it abused. We don't want a terrorist, for instance, to come and pose as an asylum seeker. We don't want an illegal immigrant, as it were, somebody who is interested in something else that might be devious, to come and pose as an asylum seeker. So this particular law enables us to develop mechanisms to interview persons and determine who is a refugee and who is not. As regards people trying to cross oceans and other places and going to Europe, it's rather big discussion. A number of these people do so because of persecution back home. Others do so because of other reasons that might not be linked to persecution. But the most important thing, as far as we are concerned, if a person is unable, to live in a particular country, because that person is being persecuted, because that person is being harassed by authorities or other elements linked to the authorities for that particular matter, that person needs to be protected. And to quickly come to your question, an asylum seeker is somebody who has lodged an application and says, I want to be a refugee. That person might become a refugee or not. Okay. A refugee is a person who was an asylum seeker, lodged that application, and that application has been admitted, and the person is then granted refuge. That's how it works.
Okay. Gloria, we have in Tanzania been hosting refugees, of course. It's said way before the independence. We've had freedom fighters coming, but I wouldn't really, again, from the definition, call those as refugees. But it's said that Tanzania has been hosting refugees way before the independence. So what are the legal frameworks that protect or guide the aspects of refugees here in Tanzania?
The legal framework always starts with Constitution, which is the mother law. And the Constitution has been amended. The Constitution of the United Republic of Tanzania was amended in 1984 so as to include the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights gives the right to own property, the right to life, the right to movement. But all these rights should be according to the law of the land. Okay. Now, pre-independence, the colonial government had what we called Refugee Control and Expulsion Ordinance of 1949. Now, this dealt with the refugees who arrived in the country following the World War II.
Okay.
And then it controlled how they could live in the country, and if they are not following the mandate of the colonial government, then they could be expelled back to the European nations. Most of them came from the European nations which had lost the World War II, and they had nowhere else to go. But after independence in 1966, Tanzania passed the Refugee Control Act. Now, this came after our independence in 1961, whereby the country had a policy of open door policy, which encouraged refugees to come into Tanzania, as you said, most of them for political reasons, because the late Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere had a vision whereby we can have Pan-Africanism. To him, even when they were tabling the bill in Parliament, he thought for Tanzania to enjoy its independence, other countries should also be independent. So the bill, when passed into law, it safeguarded the interest of refugees who are in the country or who seek asylum in the country, whether they were political asylum seekers or they were normal civilians. And it put out designated areas where they could stay. But by then, there were more freedom of movement, and you could easily get permits to move out of the camp and pursue employment opportunities. And some of them even received training and education in the country. Fast forward to the 1990s, Tanzania found itself receiving a lot of refugees following the Rwanda genocide and the Burundi civil wars and the DRC Congo civil unrest. It received over 1 million refugees, which was a big number for a country to handle because of security reasons and the manpower that was involved and the economic needs that needed to be put forward. So Tanzania thought hosting refugees should be a global thing because we should share the burden of hosting the refugees. But then again, we should have set aside funds that are specifically, and other organizations should also be involved into taking care of the refugees. And that's when they passed the 1998 Refugee Act that is still in existence today.
Okay.
Now, this act elaborated over a number of things which previously were not there, like security concerns. It put more strict, should say, rules on arms, owning arms and using arms for refugees, because then some of them were militant groups from their countries of origin. Okay. So it put more strict rules on that. But then again, it established what we call the National Eligibility Committee. Now, this committee is there to make sure that every individual that's seeking asylum in Tanzania can be interviewed by the National Eligibility Committee, and if they pass to get the status of a refugee, now they can then become refugees. So our policy also, surprisingly, it came back in 2003. Remember, the Mwalimu Nyerere policy was not documented anywhere. It was just the feeling of the country in Pan-Africanism. But in 2003, that's when we had the first written policy. Now, this came after the law. And generally, it came like to address issues maybe that were wrong with the law, or were not much known, or were not much more amplified in the law. Okay. You see? So this came later on, but does it mean maybe we need to amend that law or not? We really have to address these issues. Yeah, but it came later on, and it explained why Tanzania now is interviewing individual refugee status rather than a group status, even though the law says we can do with the group status. Okay. But our focus now is interviewing as individuals rather than conferring in group status as refugees.
Okay. Your Excellency, just to get the feel, what numbers are we looking at in Tanzania in terms of how many refugees do we have? How many refugee camps are still active? Have we closed any? I remember during the previous regime, there was a notion of, letting, because we do not have, we do not force refugees to go back to their countries, but voluntary repatriation. The government was sort of like promoting that the refugees should go back home because the environment that caused them to flee at first instance has been sort of like resolved. There are no issues back at home. So what numbers do we have now? And do we still have refugees wanting to go home? And how is that going?
Okay. The numbers have grown much smaller.
Okay.
We're talking of about 251,000 persons or thereabouts, because the numbers keep changing every day.
Okay.
People are born, people go back home, people also die, unfortunately. So the camps, there are 3 camps. You have Nyarugusu camp in a place called Kasulu, Kigoma region. Then you have Mtendeli and Duta refugee camp. So there are only 3 camps. And in a short while, we intend to close Mtendeli refugee camp. We are doing what is called a camp consolidation. So the few people that would have remained in Mtendeli will be moved into Nduta refugee camp as they are waiting to go back home when the time is right for them to do so. The point to understand here is that we don't force people to go back home unless they elect to do so of their own volition. But if the situation does improve to a point whereby their stay in the country is not tenable because factors that actuated their flight from the country of origin to seek refuge in the first place no longer obtain, then we'll ask them what they are doing here when we do what is called a cessation clause, and then tell them, now look, I think the situation has improved, you can go back. Just like you had refugees from South Africa in Tanzania some time back. They are no longer here because the situation in South Africa is okay, the apartheid regime is no longer there, so they have no business being here. Now, in terms of other camps, you know, Tanzania has been hosting refugees for a long time, and for a while you had large settlements in a place called Mishamo, Katumba, Uliankulu in Tabora. This settlement, the persons who are staying there have more or less left. You have a very small residual caseload that is still there that we are asking the government to consider for local integration. By that we mean for them to be naturalized as Tanzanians because they have been born here, they have been here for close to 50 years, 48 years now because they came in 1972 from Burundi. So that is the situation. As regards going back home, we are now in the middle of a voluntary return to Burundi. And since February 2017, over 130,000 people have been assisted to go back to the country of origin, Burundi. We are still assisting more to go back. And if the situation goes well, in another couple of years or so, the bulk of the Burundi refugees would have gone back until, you know, maybe when we invoke a cessation clause is when we might ask people, why aren't you going home now?
Okay.
Yeah.
And what nationalities do we have at the moment as refugees?
Okay, the 2 main nationalities you have here are persons from the Democratic Republic of Congo and Burundians. Okay. You have very few other nationalities, like a few people from Rwanda, a few persons from the Sudan, a few persons from countries like Pakistan, almost 200 or so persons, mainly resident in Dar es Salaam. But the bulk of the population is from those 2 countries.
Okay. Gloria, just to understand the parameters or the framework in the country, at what point in time have we had cases whereby the refugees probably felt they wanted to remain back in the country, and would the framework allow them to seek for nationality or local integration, as Ambassador has said?
As a matter of fact, there are some Burundians who arrived in 1972. They've been integrated into Tanzania by being given citizenship. We call the process naturalization.
Naturalization.
Now some of them become citizens, but this process also takes time because you need to go through the paperwork, you need to assimilate them one person after the other. So it has been done in stages. And at some point, those people, the Burundians, have been saying that it's taking a lot of time. But then again, it's not taking a lot of time. It's just like it has to be done in stages to make sure that all of them can be naturalized and put into the system. But in our law, as such, in the legal framework, the Refugee Act of Tanzania of 1998 does not say anything about reintegration, like naturalizing them. But in practice, that has been done.
Okay.
You see, other ways is resettling them into other countries which are willing to receive them, and maybe naturalize them into their countries or give them the refugee status. That way the workload can be shared with so many other countries. Just remember, there are other countries who do not receive asylum seekers or do not receive refugees because of maybe countries around them, they are peaceful and there's no need for them to...
Are they by that statement, you mean they've not signed the convention, so to say?
No, they have signed the convention, but...
Then why would they not receive refugees?
There are no refugees around them.
Oh, there are no refugees around them.
Yes, that's why
Okay,
they do have a program whereby they receive the refugees in a country which have refugee designated areas like Tanzania. You see, that way they share the load. You see, instead of Tanzania just hosting all those refugees, they can share the load by having those other people who are in designated areas asking to be resettled in another country. It could be another country in Africa, it could be another country in Europe, it could be another country in America. So that way they share the load of taking care of refugees.
Ambassador George, we are celebrating 70 years of UNHCR. Looking on to over 82 million people displaced globally, really, I really am trying to see the efforts that have been put. You know, we've explored a little bit about Tanzania, looking on to other countries globally, but what is there to look up and say, yes, we are really proud that we've made these strides?
I think I'll probably go back and echo what then High Commissioner for Refugees, Mr. Guterres, who is now the Secretary General, said some time back.
Yes.
He said that the situation we are facing now, we are seeing unprecedented numbers, and the expectation that the humanitarian community, the NGOs and the UN, as it were, will take care of this problem is no longer tenable. The expectation now should be for countries to ask themselves, why do we have these high numbers and why do they keep going up? And like the gracious lady here was saying, it's incumbent upon the leadership in a number of countries to think seriously about addressing refugee-causing situations on their territory. There is no pride in celebrating 70 years with 82 million displaced persons. That's too huge a number.
It is.
So I would really urge member states, and when we talk of the UN here, we're actually talking of member states,
Correct.
which includes Tanzania and other refugee-producing countries, that the way home in dealing with this situation is to address the root causes of refugee problems. Organizations like SADC, ECOWAS, the East African Community, the AU are organs that should take a lead and should not shy from remonstrating fellow member states when they create refugee situations in this kind of manner. That is the way to go about it now. Of course, the humanitarian community will be there to try and help. But it's like a drop in the ocean when you're dealing with these huge numbers. There has to be a change, a strategy, a change of tact in addressing refugee situations.
This is the Monday Agenda, and the Monday Agenda is looking onto the 70 years since the establishment of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee. And with me on the program is Ambassador George Kuchio, who is the UNHCR Deputy Representative, and Ms. Gloria Kalabamu, the Vice President of the Tanganyika Law Society, and we're looking onto, you know, the 70 years of UNHCR, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee, and the journey that the organization, the global organization, has taken to date, looking onto the global perspective, but as well looking onto the local perspective. Gloria, maybe to understand, and I really am happy that you've made time for this program, but to understand, refugees, if there's an article on the newspaper anywhere about refugees, you know, people look at that article with caution. What have they done now? Have they, you know, broken the camps and they've ran into the villages, etc., etc. So what are some of the challenges, you know, that are associated with hosting refugees for countries like Tanzania?
There's several challenges. Some might look perceived and some are the reality. For instance, the environmental degradation challenge. In most of our camps, people, the refugees need to cook for themselves, for example. Now they need to collect firewood in neighboring areas so that they can go and cook for themselves. So most local communities have been really lamenting about the environmental challenges that results. But then again, there's land that would have been used by local communities but has been assigned for refugees. For instance, in the National Refugee Policy, a camp need to have only 50,000 people, and camp need to a distance of like 30 kilometers between each camp. This means that we have to have more camps so that one particular camp is not overflooded with people and can lead into environmental issues. But while we are solving the environmental issues, we get into trouble with taking more land for the local communities. Another thing has been associated with, but has no proof direct empirical data, is the security concern. Of course, there are some militias that penetrate and become refugees, and these can go into their country of origin and cause trouble from the camps. But then there are stringent rules that make sure that they do not have access to arms, but they can hide them somewhere. And in Kagera region, for example, in the past, there have been so many complaints of having refugees who, with arms, are robbing the people, especially in the bus movement and everything. So these are kind of the challenges that, as a country, we encounter. But let's not also forget the economic toll into the country. You see, Tanzania had to host them, the refugees, and it has to use some of its budget either for the refugees directly or for the local community, making sure that maybe protection to security concerns are covered and more protection has been assigned to those areas according to the needs. So these are some of the challenges that we get from having refugees in the country.
Gloria, back to you again. You know, I've asked His Excellency the Ambassador this same question that I really want to ask you. Looking back into the refugee situation in Tanzania, and this being the 70th anniversary of UNHCR globally, what as a country are we celebrating?
Well, as a country, we are celebrating our humanity, that we were able, through those 70 years, we have been hosting, because I told you the first pre-independence law was passed in 1949 to host some Europeans which came to the country. So we have been doing this for more than 70 years, actually. With 49, that makes it around 72 years, you see. So we are good human beings who are taking care of our neighbors. We're keeping the Pan-Africanism spirit very bright and shining, you know. So we are celebrating of being humane enough to take care of our brothers and sisters from other jurisdictions. You see, that's what we are celebrating. We are not celebrating the fact that they have to come. That's what we're not celebrating. We could rather they didn't come and they have peace where they're coming from.
Your Excellency, George, she's spoken of the challenges, and I was hoping maybe she could have expanded to speak of the benefits as well, but let's hear that from you.
Yeah, okay, maybe just a couple of words on the challenges before maybe I look at the benefits.
Sure.
You see, the challenges are there, like Madame here has outlined, and they are serious challenges. But I want to say one thing. We in UNHCR say we protect people from persecution.
Yes.
We don't protect people from prosecution. If you have a refugee here who is a bad element, who is picking up a gun, who is going to steal, who is attacking somebody, that refugee should be prosecuted like any other person. In fact, if you look at the 1951 convention that I spoke about, there are certain provisions that can lead to the refugee status of a person being taken away on account of some of these things. So I want to make that very clear, that we are not here to protect bad elements. Having said so, let me delve to another point before I directly answer your question. That one thing that we don't realize is we look at it as they, the refugees, and us. But anybody can be a refugee. That is the cardinal point. Anybody can be a refugee. Any person can find him or herself in a situation whereby that person has to flee. And I recall, just to give you an example, and I said this before, when I worked in Eritrea, my interlocutor in government was a gentleman who had a very hardline stance in terms of refugee matters. He had no time for refugees. I'm not talking of the country, I'm talking about individuals.
Yes.
And I recall when I worked in Geneva, meeting this gentleman on the street. And I asked him, hey, sir, what are you doing here? And he told me I'm a refugee. So you see that kind of thing. And if you go back times, somebody will tell you Jesus was a refugee. Muhammad was a refugee as well. So this refugee situation, let's look at it as something that can catch up with people who never intended to be refugees. That having been said, we should do all that we can to avoid refugee situations. We don't want refugee situations. We want them to be done away with, like the mandate of the office that was 3 years. The international community has to work and stop these refugee generating situations. In terms of benefits, refugees can come with a lot of benefits. There is a poster, big poster, you probably have seen it. It says something like, a bundle of belongings isn't the only thing that a refugee brings to his country.
Yes.
And it talks of a man called Einstein. Einstein was a superb scientist, the man who was involved in the nuclear, whatever, formation and things like that. He was a refugee. So refugees can bring in lots of benefits. Within the refugee population, it's not just people who are beggars or something like that. They are professionals like you and I. They are teachers, they are nurses, they could be doctors and other people. And the knowledge of these persons can be tapped on in terms of bringing development in a country where they go. Now, a number of Western countries seem to have seen that potential more than us on the African continent. Because there is something called resettlement. There are 3 solutions to a refugee. The first one, of course, is we want the refugee to go back home.
Yes.
The second one is what we alluded to. The refugee could be integrated or naturalized, in the country where the refugee is resident. But the third one, which you perhaps are not aware about, every year, thousands of refugees are resettled from the African continent. I think the quota now is about 50,000. It used to be 90,000. It's now coming down to about 50,000 persons are resettled. They immigrate permanently to countries like Canada, the United States of America, European countries, Belgium, Sweden, and other countries. And they go in these countries being helped by those countries. But after these countries have also seen the potential in these persons that can be tapped on to make their life a better life. And this is something we should think of, that when we have refugees here as a population, what is good in that population that we can use in terms of developing our countries. But ultimately, I want to say that the refugee situation should gradually and as far as practicable brought to an end at some point in the future.
Excellent, Your Excellency.
I'm sorry, just to
Gloria,
add
go
on
ahead.
that.
Yes.
The refugee being in Tanzania somehow also increased the number of employment to Tanzanians because they work into organizations that provide services for refugees.
Okay.
You see, and they also get market to the local people. Some of their goods can be bought by those organizations and they can be distributed. But these other the refugees also need other essentials which they can get from local markets around there.
Okay.
And as well as like interact and maybe get somebody to marry at some point.
At what particular point, because I beg to understand that the refugees are not supposed to be working, they're supposed to be taken care of by the host country. And probably the issues of intermarriages as well. Maybe you can expound on that?
A refugee stays in a designated area.
Correct.
But the right to work is not taken from them. Actually, the law allows the person to work. What you need is to have a permit which will allow you to pursue your vocation.
Okay.
Also, you can even study outside the camp, so long as you have the permit that allows you to actually go and do something.
Okay.
So it's not like they're supposed to stay in camp in designated area all times.
Okay.
You see, they can have permits that allows them to work or that allows them to pursue further education.
All right.
So during those periods, they can also get married to somebody. I know a person who married a Chaga.
Okay.
And he was a Burundian.
All right. I mean, well, you don't know where your lucky Prince Charm is. Gloria, what then needs to be done by our legal systems, our legal framework that ensures or to ensure that we are in line with the international or regional, as Ambassador had mentioned, these frameworks, the SADC, the ECOWAS, that our systems are, I wouldn't say compliant to, but are in parallel vision to those of regional and international frameworks?
First off,
If at all they're not.
Yeah.
Yes.
First of all, I would like to say that in practice, Tanzania has been keeping with the spirit of the Refugee Convention for all this time in which it has been receiving refugees for over the 70 years of the Refugee Convention in practice. As I said, for example, integration is not into the law, but has been in practice done.
Yeah.
You see. And of particular interest, Section 21 of the Refugee Act, it says when doing their jobs, the authorized officer should take into consideration first the Constitution of Tanzania, as I said, the United Republic of Tanzania of 1977. As I said, it provides rights of the people, right to dignity, for example. You see? And also it says it should take into consideration the international laws that govern refugees, whether they are from the SADC, the OAU region, or the AU now region, or the UN conventions or protocols under the conventions. So the Tanzanian law already accepts international standards, and in practice we already practice the best practice under the Refugee Conventions and the Refugee Act. That notwithstanding, I would also like to see we have clear-cut regulations on several matters. For example, if we say the refugees have to be interviewed individually under the National Eligibility Committee, you see, we should see how this committee works in a regulation, and we should also see how the chain of appeal after my application has been denied for refugee status, I can appeal to the minister, and the minister can just deny it on national security reasons. We should also see what would amount to national security reasons in the perspective of our country in Tanzania. I know it is also allowed under the Refugee Convention that you can deny a person due to national security reasons. But these national security reasons should be at least expounded on. We should know what are they, you see. And another thing, since we already have a policy that came after the law, now it's about a good time to merge the policy and the law so that they can, you know, like be harmonized, working in tandem. But all in all, I would say we have been doing pretty well in being humane enough to our fellows.
Ambassador George, this would be my very last question, and basically you've mentioned it somehow during the explanation, but celebrating 70 years of UNHCR, in your vision, wishful thoughts, how do you see the next 70 years of United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees?
I am a bit of an optimist, and I think in the next 70 years, we shouldn't be talking about UNHCR or large refugee situations. We should be talking about something else. I know biblically, as a Christian, the Bible talks of turmoil, and more turmoil toward the end.
More
but I think the international community and the world is improving. If you look at some of the countries that have been, I'm now talking of the African continent, involved in refugee-generating situations, this is more or less petering out. If you look at a country like Burundi now, peace is being attained in that particular country. The gracious lady here mentioned Rwanda, for example. We have countries that Tanzania hosted all those years, from apartheid, South Africa, Mozambique, Namibia, Zimbabwe. Situations kind of have changed. And I think democratization is kind of taking root with civilization and people going to school. Things are being done a bit differently. So I'm optimistic that the situation should change. Obviously, 70 years from now, I'll not be there. But even in my grave, I don't want to turn and think that the refugee situation is still something that we are talking about and is being celebrated. But let me make this clear.
Yes.
She made a very good point. The celebration here is humanity, taking care of people for all these years, from the Polish refugees that were here, for the people that have been here. Imagine lives that have been saved, children who have gone to school here, mothers who've been taken care of, who have found a home here and are alive today, who would have been disseminated in their own country. So there's something good in it. But there's also a sad element. Why should this go on, protracted for 70 years? Really? And moral. So on our continent, and I know other places, I think we need to look at countries like the UK or so and say, look, we want a situation whereby we won't have people fleeing from our country to seek asylum elsewhere.
And that really marks the end of the Monday agenda, and I really am very thankful. There's so much wisdom and knowledge that I've tapped from this discussion, but I would really wish, as the very end of the program, to recall the words from the poster by Einstein that it's not just
a bundle of belongings brings in a country
into the country.
Yeah, there's more to it.
There's more to it. Yeah. So let's and you also said that we should, pleading to the countries that they should really be keen not to create refugee situation. And I think as we celebrate the 70 years, that's the message that I would really wish passed across, so that next 70 years we're not talking refugees. Sure. So for me, it's really to thank you for your time, making it to the Monday agenda. I believe it's really been very informative, and my viewers have really enjoyed. I'm your host, Austin Makani. George Kuchio, thank you very much. And very many congratulations as you celebrate the 70 years. We celebrate with you as media, and I believe Tanganyika Law Society as well, and the good works that you do. Let's just embrace the good humanity, so that we make world a better place and not a place where people run and causing refugee situation. And with these few remarks, I would like to really say thank you for watching the Monday Agenda. Until next time, I'm your host, Austin Makani. Stay tuned.